The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, I'd like to welcome you to our Ask the Expert webinar on asset management. My name is Savannah Bekowski, and I work at the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. We have a great session lined up for you today, but before we begin, there are a few logistics that we need to cover. Everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality for today's session. Since today's webinar is focused on answering your questions, please draw your attention to the question box on your control panel. If you have a question, please type it into there at any time throughout the session. Your question will be queued for our experts to answer. We will be posting a video recording of today's webinar along with the presentation slides. We will be posting them on our website, and you can reach that at www.efcnetwork.org. All of our webinars will be found under the Past Events tab. A follow-up email will include a link to all of these materials shortly after this podcast. We do not submit webinars to licensing agencies for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but we do send certificates of attendance as a courtesy. It can take up to 1 to 2 weeks to send out the certificates of attendance, and you must attend this entire webinar to receive them. You must have joined this webinar by the unique join link that you received when you registered in order for us to document your attendance. We cannot guarantee that this webinar will meet requirements for CEU or license renewal needs. So if you have any questions about this process, you can email us at smallsystems@syr.edu. So for a little bit about us, the Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small public water systems in all U.S. states and territories to help those local water systems achieve their goals and stay in compliance with the Safe Drinking Water Act. And here you can see the various centers that make up the Environmental Finance Center Network. We have centers and partner organizations spread throughout the entire country for this year's programming. We work together to create solutions for difficult how-to-pay issues of environmental improvement and protection. And on this note, I would like to introduce both of our experts for today's webinar. We have Heather Himmelberger, Director of the Southwest Environmental Finance Center at the University of New Mexico, and Ross War, owner of War Infrastructure Management located in New Zealand. Heather and Ross, welcome, and take it away.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for being here today. We really appreciate you participating in this webinar, and wanted to give just a little bit of intro before we get started. Again, my name is Heather, and with me today is my very good friend and colleague Ross, and we're so delighted to have him here in New Mexico today. Long journey from New Zealand, where he does lots and lots of asset management related work there, and is really involved in the cutting edge of all kinds of things asset management. So we're super excited that he can be with us today. Many of you had submitted questions prior to the webinar. So when you registered, you put some questions in. That's what we're going to use to start our discussions today. We've looked at those questions, we've tried to group them, and where there were topics that lots of people asked questions about, those are the ones we're going to start with first. We don't think we have time to get to everybody's questions today just because there were so many submitted, and some of them were just very focused on an individual issue. In that case, we'll try to reach out more directly to the person who asked the question rather than sharing it on today's webinar. And then we also want to make sure that there's opportunities for those of you on the webinar today who maybe didn't get a chance to submit your question ahead, or as our discussion progresses, you think of a question. So please feel free to type your questions into the chat box or the question box and share them with us, and we'll get to those. We have a point in the discussion today where we're going to reach out and see if anybody has submitted questions, and then if things come in along the way, we'll try to get to those questions as well. So again, thanks to Ross for being here today. And our first discussion topic is getting started with asset management, because we had lots and lots of folks who had submitted questions that related in various ways to how do I get going if I'm not doing asset management. I haven't done it before, I don't really know where to start, you know, how do I get started? So Ross, why don't you start us off talking about things you've seen and ideas you have for getting started with asset management.
Thank you, Heather. And this slide we're looking at here is one that I produced for a paper for a conference back in New Zealand about 3 years ago. And it was very nice because the paper actually won Best Asset Management Paper for that conference, which was good. But what I'd found at the time is that we've got a huge number of manuals and guides and other information standards around asset management, and it was starting to just feel like it was too complex, and it's actually quite simple. So the paper was about simplifying asset management, and this was the key diagram for that. And I thought I'd just talk briefly through this diagram and as a how do you get started. And sitting underneath the diagrams, that bar that says asset inventory, some countries call it asset register, but underpinning all asset management is an asset inventory. So it's a listing of what you own, where it is, what condition it's in, how old it is, because that information and how it's performing perhaps as well, is it delivering what you need it to? Because that information, that just little subset of information there can allow you to make a huge number of decisions and just spend your money wisely in the right place. On the left-hand side of the diagram are the three boxes: levels of service, future demand, and risk. We're having a debate at the moment as to whether you would add a fourth box around climate adaptation / sustainability, and then there's another conversation what that all means. But with levels of service, and I think it's levels of service is one of those things that everybody thinks, oh, what's that? And when we started more than 20 years ago in New Zealand, we had the same question. And the first thing you do with levels of service is you write down what you're actually doing now. So if it's a certain operations or a certain set of maintenance that you're doing, or some capital that you do every now and again, just write those down, and there'll be a reason why you're doing all of those, and that starts the basis of your levels of service. And then you can start looking at, we've got some stuff from permits or from regulation or from EPA or whatever it is that might be some extra levels of service you may or may not be reaching at the moment, or you might have to do some more work to get to them. Future demand is an interesting one because it can be increases in demand if you're in a rapidly or a growing area. It can be decreases in demand if you're in an area that's shrinking. And so it's about what's happening with, have you got some new big industries coming, or are some leaving, and is the demand changing? And it's how much is it going to change, and why is it changing is the questions you're trying to ask there. And risk is just about a whole lot of risks. So you could have natural hazard risk or catastrophe type risks. You can have organisational risks around, can we keep the right qualified staff and experience, down to the concept of asset criticality. So which assets are the most important to us, which hurt us the most if they fail, what would cause, if it failed, the most damage to other assets or to the environment. And it can also be around your treatment processes, risks to not producing water well, or to water to the right standard, and all of those sorts of things. So they're all grouped under risk. Once you know all of those, then you can start having a look at how you manage the total life cycle of the assets, and that's your operations, your maintenance, your asset renewal or replacement or rehabilitation, any new assets that you need, and then sometimes you need to dispose of assets. And an example would be a treatment facility it's at the end of life. You might need to dispose of that and build a new one or something like that. And then you're looking at, well, okay, what can we do different to make that spend our money more wisely in the right sequence? And is there some things we're doing we don't need to do anymore, or are there things that we're not doing that we need to do? So that's your life cycle management. And then out of that drops financials. And when I was a young engineer, I used to only think about expenditure. People would give me money and I would build things, and that was great fun. But there's a bit more to operating a network or a system than that. You do have to operate and maintain. You do have to replace, rehabilitate, renew assets. You do have to build new stuff from time to time. And you might have to depreciate. In New Zealand, we have to fund asset depreciation, which we're a bit unusual That's not many countries do that. But the other side of it, somebody's got to pay for it. And that might be for fees, charges, tariffs, loans, grants, funding, bonds, state revolving fund, all of those sorts of things. And what you want to spend and where you're getting your money for at some stage has to line up, and that can be quite a discussion. So coming back to, hey, how do you start? The simple starting point is put an inventory together and then start working your way through your service levels, your demand and your risks, and your life cycle management of your assets.
I think that's great advice. So if you haven't already done your asset inventory, you know, that's a really good starting place. So we have another interesting slide here. This is Super Bowl a couple of years ago, the Philadelphia Eagles. And Ross, why don't you tell us why you might have picked a slide about Super Bowl to put up here?
Yeah, so one of the things that, and this is not just in the US and New Zealand, worldwide, I originally came up with a slide for this for a conference up in Canada that had US DOTs. When a sports team wins, whatever sport it is, they win because they do the basics very, very well. And in terms of Super Bowl, obviously, if you don't get the ball back to your quarterback, and the quarterback doesn't get the ball forward to the guys who are sprinting up the side of the line, or the running backs or whatever, you're not going to win. You're not going to score points. And the point that the teams, basketball's the same, baseball, the teams that do exceptionally well do the basics very, very well. They keep the scoreboard ticking over, and then they do the fancy stuff on top of that. And, you know, the really exceptional plays are built off a platform of doing the basics of their game exceptionally well. And asset management's like that. And I think often we want to do the fancy stuff. But the reality is you get 80% of your gains from 20% of your work, and that's the basics, the really rock solid operations, maintenance, capital and replacement planning. And it doesn't have to be fancy, but you do have to do it well and consistently well. And so that analogy, I think all of us understand sports and winning, and we'll yell at the television if our team's doing the basics poorly. Go, what are you guys thinking? You know, how can you possibly muck that up? And asset management's just like that. You know, it's do the basics well consistently, and you'll make the yards, and you'll get the gains that you need, and the results that you need. And if you don't do the basics well, the opposite happens, and you just end up in a world of trouble, and it often just compounds. So that's the sports picture. We chose the Eagles because the current Super Bowl obviously is coming up. We didn't want to favour one team or the other, and Heather's husband Lance is a great Eagles fan, and he's converted me to being an Eagles fan, and so I've been following them ever since for a couple of years. And they didn't make it so well this year, but they're a good team. So,
yeah, and another thing to think about, I think that just goes along the theme Ross is talking about, is it does not have to be, for a small community, a very complicated thing. And the smaller you are, the less complicated it needs to be. And we have some discussion about that later on as well, of just, again, keep it simple. You know, do your inventory as a starting place, figure out what you need to know, figure out what the basics are, how well you're doing it, and keep it simple so that you don't feel overwhelmed and just so just feeling you don't know what to do, that you don't do anything. I mean, just starting simply can really get you, just the inventory alone will get you so much further than you realize, that you'll start to see benefits from asset management just from doing an inventory and figuring out what you have and what's going on, because you can't do an inventory without laying eyes on your assets and thinking about them, and that process alone starts you in a really good place.
Yeah, and look, very small systems, maybe you've only got 100 or 200 lengths of pipe. You don't need an all singing, all dancing piece of software to manage an inventory. You know, just a very simple spreadsheet or database will do that for you, and you can get going really quickly with that. If in the future you decide you need something a lot more sophisticated, you can migrate across to that at the time. But I think sometimes we try and make the job much harder than it is. And I know the EFC, you've got some really good guides on just the information to collect for just a simple starting inventory.
Yes, and we have been working on a switchboard, and we'll show a slide of that later on of where you can get it. But we developed a switchboard that will have all the resources for asset management from around the country, all the free stuff, to make it easier to find things. Like we have an Excel spreadsheet for how, for getting started on a inventory. So that will be a good place for people to look as well, that has lots and lots of resources that systems can use. And this is not a start from scratch thing. This is a, steal ruthlessly from everybody else who's gone before you, and take their stuff, use it, take the pieces that work for you, and you don't have to start from scratch each time. So I think with that, we'll move on to our next subject that we got a lot of questions about. And we've started touching on this a little bit, just questions around small systems and doing asset management, and the idea of whether or not small systems can do this, or whether this is just a big system issue. And to start with, yes, there is no size too small to do asset management. You can do it yourself. I use it all the time. I'm sure Russ does as well in our own personal lives, with assets that I own, like a house and a car. I've used it many times, that type of thinking. So let's talk a little bit, Russ, about small systems and how asset management fits them.
Yeah, and look, I think with a small system, the reality is between the engineer or the administrator and the supervisor, and maybe if your field crews, you know everything that you need to know. It's just maybe you haven't pulled it all together. And so that's why the comments on the slide there is keep it simple. And we've already talked about the inventory. You can put together off the plans that people have and the information they have. In a small system, you can do that in a day, even half a day. Just get the inventory, get everybody in the room, and just nut it out. If something's on the plan that's changed, the guys who are seeing it every week, they'll say, oh no, that's not right, we changed that 5 years ago or whatever. And then the other thing with the brainstorming major issues, like different systems have different issues based on how they've been built, or where their wells are, or if they've got a tank or several tanks, or whatever it is. Sometimes the quality of the water, or so you can again put everybody in the room for a very short period of time. So hey, look, what's coming up that's concerning us? And somebody say, oh look, the main pump, it's dodgy, it's just not working that well. And you go, okay, right, well, write down main pump needs some attention. Or maybe you got a tank and you got a pipe coming off the tank that's just getting really old and starting to burst a bit, and you go, well, oh yeah, we got this pipe that's just about at the end of its life off our main tank. And it's just the major issues, not the little stuff. Not, oh, I've got 5 service lines on 5th Street that are leaking. That's the little stuff. This is the major issues. Maybe your major issue is your superintendent, who's been in the place for 30 years and knows everything, is retiring next year, and a whole heap of information that's in his head and all that experience is going to go. And then maybe he's going to retire into your area, so he's still there as a resource if needed. But maybe he's going to go and live with his kids, and he's 20 states away, and that's more of an issue. So it might not just be, your issues might not just be physical asset issues. They might be risks around people and the knowledge that those people have. And then around the risks, this is the phone call at night. So this is the classic. If your phone went off at 2 o'clock in the morning, you're on the call for problems in the network, and your mind goes, oh boy, I really hope it isn't that, because that is just about an unsolvable problem. That's your major risk. And I've tried this a few times with clients, and they always come up. It'll be, oh yeah, my tank's just got, it's up in the air and it's on a stand that's got rust all over it, and we're not sure. And if it fell over, I don't know what we'd do. So you can, or it might be that a pump's is very old, or it might be a really important pipe is right at the end of its life, or any other number of issues. So that's a good test. If I get the phone call at 2 in the morning, what would I really hope it's not being? And so the answer to that test is not, I turn my phone off at 10 o'clock. Because all that means is it's there for you in the morning and it's been running for, whatever's been happening has been happening for 12 hours at that point. So, but again, that gives you real clarity on what your major risks are, because you instinctively know what they are. You can go through a very structured process and produce heaps of data, but generally between your engineer or administrator and your supervisor and your field crews, a couple of hours in a room with the map of the network will tell you what those are very quickly. And then you can start, hey, what are we going to do about those? Do we need to intervene earlier or later? Staff retention and replacement is going to be an issue, particularly for small systems. The days, certainly in New Zealand, and I think the case also in the US, the days of people starting work in a water network or a wastewater network, sewer network, at 20 years old out of school or early out of university and staying there for the rest of their career, those days are gone pretty much. And so what are you going to do about replacing long-term experience when it leaves? And maybe Heather, you've got some insights around that.
Yeah, and I think that's an issue we've seen a lot of different places, is how do you get somebody to come? How do you keep them there? How do you train them so that they're going to do what you want while they're there? And the more remote and rural the system is, sometimes the harder that is. And money is a big part of that, because a very small utility can't afford necessarily to pay a lot of money for an operator. And one of the things to look to is your neighbors. How can you share an operator? So that sometimes is a way to get you an answer. If there's 3 or 4 of you, maybe not super close together, but close enough that an operator can travel relatively easily between the systems, that's a way to try to get around that problem, because then if each of you puts a fourth of the salary in, the person can make a decent enough money to stay there, be trained and help you, but you're not having to pay the whole salary, because it can be very, very difficult for a small utility to really come up with enough money to get a qualified operator, retain them, keep them there. And in the past, we've had lots of volunteers who have really stepped up and have been wonderful operators, but it's getting harder and harder to get those people who want to dedicate so much of their free time and their effort to the system. And as we move into a model of paying for people, that's going to be a much tougher thing if we can't figure out how to pay them, reasonable amount of money to stay.
And we joke in New Zealand with the smaller and more rural systems that they need to run a dating service so that the person coming finds a nice partner in the area and local person and then wants to stay. And it's a good joke, but there's a little bit of truth in it as well, that somebody's going to stay in a district or a network or an area, they have to have a reason to do that. And so it's thinking through, well, what attracts people to this place and why would they stay? And I think everywhere worldwide people have that problem. So.
Yeah, and then we did have some questions coming in about, small systems, and is it worth, spending small system dollars on asset management, because you do have such limited funding available and you have so few customers that are paying. And I think we wanted to talk some about the fact that, the benefits will justify your investment. And if you actually go through the process of inventorying your assets and mapping them out, even if it's a simple map, the time you save from looking for those later, or the person who knows everything leaves and you don't know anything, that time to find those assets is just really inefficient. And then as you start moving into things like criticality and addressing your risks, you're going to start to see tremendous benefits from doing the work that more than justify the investment that you're going to make in it. And it doesn't, again, we talked about this, it doesn't have to be a complicated thing. Just asking yourself simple questions. Why am I doing this?
Yeah.
What's the reason I'm doing this and not that? Or the phone call at night, what am I doing about that thing?
Yeah.
If that happens to be my one and only well pump, and I know that it's ready to go out at any moment and I won't have any water for my customers, then what am I doing about that? You know, what is the plan? Is there any plan in place to take care of that? So asset management helps you think through those questions of, okay, well, if I need to replace the pump or I need to rehabilitate it or something like that, what's the funding mechanism for that? You know, what is the life cycle around that? What kind of operation and maintenance should I be doing? All of those types of things. So you should, even in a small utility, you should be able to see some decent benefits. If you even do the simple stuff with asset management, the benefits should justify the investment.
And sometimes something as simple as just keeping a record of all the breaks and putting them up on a map year on year. And then you go, hey, we're getting a lot of breaks in this particular area or on this particular set of pipes. And then you can start asking those why questions. Why are we getting all those breaks when we're not getting them in other places? And it might be a poorly installed pipe, or it might be a material that's got some faults, or it might be your pressure's too high there, or a whole heap of number. Like one example we had in New Zealand was this particular bit of pipe was getting some water hammer on it off a pump. And so, you know, they'd go and fix it, they'd put a new pipe in and break again. You go, what's going on? Well, you're sending some water hammer up the line because the pump's not set up right and it didn't have a pressure reduction or a pressure relief vessel on the pump. Or a variable speed drive to ramp it up nice and quiet, just slamming on and slamming off. And the people in the area had forgotten about what water hammer does when it goes up and down a pipe. And it was really, really simple to fix, but you have to ask the question, why is that happening? Because you can go fix pipes from forever. But once you start asking the questions, the other thing with asset management, even with very, very small systems, is if there's some big dollars coming up, a big pump or a tank or a big pipe replacement, and you go, oh, how are we going to afford this? But you know it's 5 years away. You can start the discussion in the community and with the governance of that system. Say, look, we've got this really big dollars coming up, and we think it's real, and this is what it looks like. By the time you get to the time to do the work, the community or the governance board, the council, they've had the discussion. They know it's going to be a bit painful, but everybody's accepted the fact that they need to do it. You've looked around for different ways of funding it. Maybe there's a state grant or something like that. But it takes the pain out of it. What happens, and it's even in our own lives with our own expenditure. You know, if you know something's coming, you can plan for it and you can put aside some money or whatever, or get a loan sorted or whatever. If it just something really big happens and you've got to deal with it today with no warning, that's where it's a bit more problematic. And so the same thing with water networks, wastewater networks. Certainly we found in New Zealand, if you give people plenty of advance warning of a big expenditure, by the time you get to it, they've worked out how they're going to afford it, and there's no pain and there's no drama around it. So that's a real advantage, because it allows good, solid decision making. It allows people to work out how they're going to afford stuff that they have to do. You know, if you've got one well pump and it drops out and you've got no water, you don't have too many choices at that point. You're going to spend the money, but much better to give people long-term warning on it and work out what you're going to do. Maybe your well's starting to get pretty old as well, and you go, hey, we're going to actually do a whole new well at the same time. And so you're not just doing a crisis thing, you're doing it in a very planned and careful and well-considered manner.
And I think, some folks asked about, what about low-hanging fruit and how can you get there? And one of the ways, especially with small systems, one advantage small systems have is there's a lot fewer people to get on the asset management train than if you're at a big utility and you've got to convince a whole bunch of people that this is worth doing. That's actually a lot harder than a small utility where there's very few people who actually work there, and you can get them all in a room and you can all work together and talk. So there are actually some advantages to small system asset management over a larger system. And one of them has to do with this low-hanging fruit and quick wins. And oftentimes what we can do with a small utility is just tell us a problem you have. Like, what is going on in your system that is a problem, you have it today, and you would love to solve it, or at least get in a better place. It could be something as simple as, I don't know where all the meters are. So you say, okay, well, if that's one of your problems, I don't know where my customer meters are, and I don't know if everybody has one, I don't know if they all work. That's a great place to start. So you can go out and do a customer meter survey. You can do it quickly or you can do it over time, whichever works, and you start to compare the billing system list with the customer meters that you're finding, see if they match. You look to see if the meters work. You look to see if they're leaking. And almost every utility that we've dealt with on the small system side who's gone out and done a meter survey has found something that they didn't know. One example was a community that had a restaurant that didn't have a meter, and it was the biggest restaurant in town. So all this time,
they're not going to tell you they haven't got a meter either.
The restaurant's not going to tell you, and that's a bunch of revenue that you lost out on. There are systems who found out multiple houses were tied into one meter. So there's going to be one very unhappy customer and one very happy customer, but it needs to be fixed. There are systems that found the meter was sending a signal, but the signal was off, sometimes by a factor of 10, sometimes by a factor of 100, meaning that they were underbilling that customer by quite a bit. So by fixing that problem, you have additional revenue. So this can be really big stuff where if you're looking at a problem that you're having at your system and seeing how just asking yourself some questions, going through a strategic thinking process can help resolve that, you can have a win relatively quickly that then prompts you to want to do more. So you don't, again, have to make asset management super, super fancy schmancy at the beginning. You just address some issue you're having to kind of get your feet wet for the type of thinking and the type of inventory you need and that kind of thing, and then use that to springboard you into doing more, so that you can get your customers and your boards and your managers, those people who make decisions to invest, you can get them on board because you have a very real thing that you can show. Hey, I had this win, or it could be where are my valves, or it could be something with hydrants or something with pipe. I mean, there's lots and lots of different starting places. Pick any of them that matter to you, and if it matters to you, you're willing to put more effort into it. So when you pick an issue that matters to your utility, you'll be more passionate about trying to solve it instead of randomly picking an issue.
Yeah, look, and I think the thing is too, it's good to communicate those wins up to your management or your governance, but even to your community if you've got a like a Facebook page or a community newsletter or whatever, because people see problems, and then when they see them fixed and you can say, hey, that saved $100,000 or a couple of $100,000, they go, wow, that's great, that's good. And or if it's you've got a whole heap of leakage and you get on top of that and you fix that, people notice that there's not all these leaks anymore, and it increases confidence in the management of the system, but it also means you're not wasting money. And generally what's happened in New Zealand is that the governance board doesn't cut the money back. They just go, hey, go fix the next problem. And so you fix the next one. They go fix the next one. And so your tariff stays the same, your revenue stays the same, your expenditure stays the same. So there's no less money, but you're actually operating more efficiently, you're not wasting money, and you're given the trust and opportunity to get on and keep ahead of the problems rather than letting them be really expensive.
Great. So we've covered the two that we had the most questions about. So we will move into another topic. We had a fair number of questions on kind of related to what are some best practices that you can do around different kinds of asset management. So I thought it'd be fun to have Ross talk about this because there's been quite a bit more implementation of asset management in New Zealand than there has in the US, although we're definitely, increasing the number of systems doing asset management, and they've had a longer history with it. So we thought it'd be a good chance to have Ross kind of talk about some of the lessons learned, some of their experience with best practices in asset management.
Yeah, and thank you, Heather. So just to give you a very quick background, New Zealand had a mandated by legislation asset management started in 1996. So it's been a fair old while. We have a 3-year political cycle, so we update our plans every 3 years. Here in the US, the suggestion would be you do your updates every 4 years to line up with political cycle. And generally we're trying, it's mandated in legislation which years they have to be updated, but it's generally the newly elected politicians get the opportunity to make the investment decisions or to modify from the previous decisions. So the plan updating is based around that. And so we're sort of into our 7th or 8th cycle of updating. And one of the things when I first started doing this stuff way back in 1996 was I was like, okay, I'm going to do an asset plan and then I'm going to go back to real work, which is, in my definition, was building stuff again. What you find out when you start doing asset management is there's so much stuff you don't know and so many assumptions you have to make and so many unknowns. And so you have what's called an improvement plan, and then you kick on and start implementing the changes you observed. You need to update information as you get some more information. And the authorities or the networks that have done well in New Zealand have been the ones that haven't stopped. So they do the mandated plan update, and then they kick on and they go, right, well, what assumptions do we need to get some better information on? Is there some pipes that we really know nothing about? Are we having some issues in a particular area that we need to do some more investigation on? And then they feed that back in to their process and update their plans and their strategies from there. We have others that finish the plan and they do nothing for 3 years, and then they scramble at the next 3 years, oh, what have we done, and things like that. So it's like any practices. If you're doing them regularly every month or every couple of months and updating information, you stay on top of it, you'll make a lot of very small incremental gains that over time end up being very large gains. If you just a very stop-start, once every 4 years, say here in the US, you will still make gains, but not as many, because the real gains in terms of your implementation and your planning is better understanding of what's going on in your network, better understanding of your condition and your performance of your assets, and better understanding of the risks and problems and where they come. And as you go through that process in an iterative way, by updating your understanding and by feeding that back into your processes and your practices, then you just embeds in the organization and it carries on through, and your reporting all starts, if you've got monthly or quarterly reporting, that all starts to flow through into that as well. And you start making very good value decisions based on better information. Buried assets, you're never going to know everything. That's a given, but you can deal with what you don't know with risk analysis. So that's the sort of the overview there. In terms of asset management plans, don't get too complicated, I think is the answer. It's really easy to produce a 300, 400, 500 page asset plan with heaps and heaps of information and nobody's going to look at. But what we've found is that if you force the discipline of simplicity on yourself, that's harder than producing great gobs of information, but it also forces you to think about what's important. And as we've gone through 5, 6, 7 cycles of this, our Auditor General, which is sort of like, I guess, the federal auditors in American terms, has said with the asset plans, your community has to have what is called the right debate. So what is the right debate for that community? And you ask even that simple question, or that network, it's not an easy question to answer. And so it forces you to refine your thinking and go, well, what is really important? Oh, I don't know what's important. Okay, well, there's a bunch of information and data I need to get my head around that. Maybe you're getting so many problems that you know what's important. You've got to fix a whole lot of brakes, or you need some new wells or some new tanks or some new treatment. So that's quite obvious. But it's getting this focus on communication, on what's important, on communicating that back to decision makers and funders so that they can get an understanding of that, and then going from there. And sometimes if you're an asset manager or an engineer, you think you know what's important, but it'll come back from the community. Well, that's what you think, but we think something else is more important. And that's part of that, just that service level definition, and working out. At the end of the day, communities will fund what they have to and what they think is important, and if they don't think things are important, they'll fight it all the way. One of the issues we're having, we had a big water incident with 5,000 people made sick from a contaminated well, essentially. It had a well, but it got some groundwater into it, and it was a big problem. And we've had our equivalent of a congressional inquiry, I guess, into that, and we've got a whole heap of legislation coming out of it and a regulator and all the things like that. There are times when, and I think Flint here in the US would be a good example, where something goes badly wrong, and all the standards change and the legislation and the rules change. And in that case, what your community thinks becomes irrelevant, because that's a new standard or legislation and you just have to do it. And so again, you have to incorporate that back into your asset management planning strategies and how you implement. The question is, are you going to front foot that, or are you going to be dragged into it? And so it's, are you going to be proactive in your management of these known issues, or are you waiting till somebody has a big stick over you? And that's I guess a management philosophy question. I think I've said enough there.
There's one thing I wanted to mention about asset management plans that is super important, is in terms of best practices and lessons learned, and that is to not think of the asset management plan as your destination. Asset management is a journey, it's not a destination, and the plan is not your destination. That's not where you're trying to get to. The plan is a way to communicate what you're trying to do with others. So your regulators, your community, your elected leaders. It is an important component, or it can be if done right, but it isn't that that's where you're trying to go. And once I get the plan done, I have achieved what I wanted to, and I just stick it on a shelf. Because if you don't do what's in the plan, you haven't accomplished anything. So what you want it to be is like, this is guiding you to the actions you want to take. And maybe it says things that you're doing well now, you want to keep doing those, or things that you aren't doing and you want to start, things you had been doing but you did them the way you shouldn't have, so you want to change. It can have all kinds of things in it. But the point is not to get this 300-page document like Ross was talking about that's beautiful with glossy pages and all this stuff in it, and then you put it on a shelf and forget about it. That isn't going to get you anywhere. What you want is a plan that's very succinct and tells you what it is you want to do and helps guide you there, that then you can implement. You can actually make change at your utility. So I look at it as a waypoint along your journey, but it isn't the destination of your journey. So it's not like I'm going to do asset management for the next year, I'm going to write a plan and then I'm done, I can check that box. I mean, that's not what asset management is about.
If a good plan too, when you write the information down and you set it out, information in tables and infographics in front of you, sometimes you go, let's take an example, you've got a particular type of pipe and you might have 500 miles of that pipe and you know nothing about it. You barely know when it went in and you're starting to get breaks on it. And so you look at that and you go, wow, actually we need to know some more about that pipe. We've got some risks there and we might need a program of replacing pipe or fixing it or some action. And so you look at your plan and this is, in New Zealand we have this time frame to get them done by, and there's always a rush at the end, and you don't get that sit back and have a look at it and go, I need to find out a whole lot more about that type of pipe, and I need to put in place a program to do that, and what's the most appropriate program. And I think when you've using asset management planning well, you take that step back, you go, right, we're going to have a 3-year program that we haven't had before about finding out about that particular type of pipe because of what we've just written about in the asset plan. So then you go, okay, maybe I need to spend $300,000 finding out about that pipe, $100,000 a year. You need to put that into your budget. And that's that sort of process where you can forward identify stuff that's starting to change, and go, okay, look, we need to get on top of that. And we can't do that with an existing appropriations or anything like that. That's where you really start getting the value out of it. But if you, as Heather said, if you just spit the thing out, or a consultant spits it out for you, you read it for 2 minutes and then you put it on the shelf, you don't get that discovery and that learning and that adjustment of programs to keep up with what's going on in the system. And I think you alluded to it there, Heather. This process, the biggest learnings are out of nutting your way through and thinking your way through the issues that you're writing about. And it's sometimes thinking is hard because you don't get the space to do it very often, and you've got all these day-to-day things that are hitting you, or reports you got to produce, or meetings you got to go to. And the real value is around stepping back, looking at what's there, going, oh, something's not quite right over there. Let's go and find some more out about that. Maybe talk to your supervisors. Maybe you go and do some engineering investigations. Don't have to do it in 1 week. You might do it over 2 or 3 years, but you're staying ahead of your problems, or staying on top of them. And that's where that real value in the thinking goes on. And it's a way of thinking, and it's a way of examining. It's a framework for examining stuff. And when you get into doing that, you can then implement and improve your system performance and expenditure, and not waste money, but also just have a more optimal expenditure profile.
Great. Okay, so now we're going to take a little break from the questions that were submitted and just see if we've had any questions come in during the webinar. So have any questions come in during the webinar?
Yes, they have. We have a few. So I will just start reading them out. So an attendee did ask if you or Ross could give some ideas on how to get some of their systems employees, such as public work employees, construction contractor, and or their subcontractors, a way for those employees to notify you of asset purchases and or repairs when they work on certain projects.
So it sounds like this is sort of one of those informational questions, which we actually had a couple of others submitted ahead of time along those same lines of how do we get information shared from, various people to each other, because it doesn't do me a whole lot of good, alluding to the question, if my contractor goes out and fixes a pump or a pipe or something and I don't know about that, it doesn't help me as much as it could, because I want to know what happened to the pipe, where did it occur, what did they do to fix it. And if that information isn't shared back and forth, it makes it really difficult to run a utility when that information isn't shared. So Ross, I know you guys in New Zealand use a lot of contractors, so
Yep.
I'm sure you face this issue. What ways do you have for people to share information?
Yeah, so we mandate in the contracts, if we've contracted work out, of which we do a lot of, that they must return certain amounts of information when they're working on assets. So, if we're doing a repair, where is it? GPS coordinates, some photos of what they've done. Depending on the asset, maybe you want a pipe sample, and things like that. And you can do that, and you can do that with your public employees, and you can deploy handheld systems either on iPads or similar, or a phone, and we're doing a lot of that sort of stuff. The gotcha in there is, and this is something we run into quite often in New Zealand, I'm sure you'll get the same thing over here, is you got this list of things that the worker in the trench has to do, and they're there fixing a meter break or a service line leak, or even a main hydrant valve type thing. They get the job finished, they got to fill in this form. Now, form filling in probably isn't what they get out of bed every morning to do. They like fixing stuff and helping their community. But because it's in the contract and their bosses have want it, they fill out the form. But what they do, guys like that, or girls that are working on it, is they ping the system. So the first month they're on the job, they write a story. Maybe it's like, hey, I was fixing this water meter, and this alligator that was 18 feet long came up and stopped me finishing the job. So we didn't put the concrete back in around it, and the alligator's still there. And they just write that and they send it in. And what they're trying to do is see if anybody's reading what they've written. And you already know the answer to that, is that nobody's reading it. It just goes into a computer or a stack of paper, and so they get no response. Because if somebody had read that, they'd call up that service person and say, hey, what's this big long story? You know, let's be a bit serious. Let's get the facts right. Don't do that again. But it never happens. And so then the next month they try it again. And okay, well maybe it just got missed. You know, so maybe somebody is reading it. So they write an even bigger, longer story. You know, there's a 50-foot python at the water meter, and he's eating, you know, all the animals in the neighborhood, and it's really stopped them fixing the job properly, and nothing happens. Nobody's read it. So at that point they go, hey, look, I'll fix everything up that I've been asked to, but I'm just going to put, it's an average condition, it's a general code, it's the easiest code to remember. You know, maybe nobody even cares terribly much about the dimensions I'm putting, so I'll just put average dimensions as well. And maybe it's a couple of feet from the fence or whatever. And it's that whole you get what you inspect type mentality. And there's no quality system around it, no checking of the information coming in. You will definitely get those sorts of issues. And we've had situations where we've gone into a job for somebody, we say, well, where's all that information? I say, oh yeah, it's in the system. So you pull it out, you see that, and the only useful piece of information that you can take away from it is if they've had a phone where they've taken a GPS. You go, okay, well, we actually know it was there, and we know the day it was, and we know that they were fixing a meter, but that's all we know. We only know those 3 pieces of information. The rest of it that you could have captured is it's just information you can't trust, because you've never given the person that's collecting the information enough incentive to do it properly. Because who likes filling in forms that nobody reads? I know I don't.
I don't either.
Yeah, so
I think part of that is making sure whatever you ask the contractor, subcontractor, or employee, it doesn't matter who it is, whoever is supposed to give you information,
yeah,
make sure you tell them what information you really want.
And why you want it.
And don't ask for a lot of extraneous stuff.
Yeah.
Because every one of us has filled out a form that just seems like half the form is ridiculous. And, you know, in healthcare, this is a big pet peeve of mine. You go
10 pages.
You know, I just want you to look at my finger that got, you know, stubbed when I was playing basketball, and I got to fill out 500 pages worth of information, none of which you're going to use, because all you're going to do is put my, you know, finger on a popsicle stick and tape it up. So why did I have to give you, you know, 10,000 bits of information? And it's the same thing here, where you don't want to have a bunch of information you're not going to use, and they don't want to fill out a bunch of information they're going to use. So try to be judicious about what are the pieces you want, make sure they understand why you want them and how you're going to use them, and then hold them accountable that they've actually done it. So whether it's a contractor or your employee, find a way to hold them accountable.
Yeah. And that means you've got to look at the information you're getting. I was doing a job in Australia a few years back, and this particular authority had decided they wanted massive amounts of information. So they had guys that were going out to a site, and they had 5 pages of closely typed tick boxes that they were supposed to go through and fill out and then sign off. And I knew for sure, I was in the yard with the whole group of these guys saying, you know, we've got to try and untangle this mess. And I said, oh, who, you guys all fill this out diligently? Yes, we do. I said, look, if it was me, I think I would just be scooting through, go tick, 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 and sign. And there's one young guy at the back of the room who wasn't as canny as the older guys, and he just smirked a little bit, told me what I needed to know, because none of them were going to admit to me that they weren't filling the forms out properly. But yeah, these were just practical guys. They're never going to go through, read each question, fill in, a choice of 15 tick boxes against each question. Just, that's not reality, especially for Australians. So yeah, and even New Zealanders or Americans, I don't think that's reality either. So it is just make sure that you're getting the only information you're asking for is information you actually need, and then make sure that somebody is looking at every month and doing some quality checks on it. And if nobody's, if you can't do that, if there's no resource for the quality checks, then the information you're going to get is going to be quite patchy.
And you're not going to be able to make as good decisions out of that. If it's not as good a data, it will limit your ability to make good decisions. And
if it's not good data, and you're not going to get good data, well then go, hey, what can we get automatically right? We just take a cell phone photo, we get the X, Y, Zs, and we know, and we get a date stamp. Okay, is that all we need? Maybe that's all we need. And maybe if you put it into a little field software, you might go, oh yeah, I want the charge code as well. That's it.
Okay, so how about other questions that may have come in?
Yeah, so the last two questions that we did receive so far are related to more funding, the funding umbrella. So
okay.
The first one, the attendee asked if you or Ross could give a little background on funding depreciation, and is funding replacement cost a more accurate approach when dealing with asset management issues?
Okay, so I'll let Ross start with that one, because it sounds like you have rules that require funding depreciation.
But I was just thinking really that we do, but we're quite unique internationally in that regard. So I think it's possibly better if you give the US experience answer there. I mean, the simple answer in New Zealand is we have to account for depreciation, and then we have to fund that as an operational cost. We have these asset depreciation accounts that build up over time, and in theory, when you go to do major replacement of assets, the money's there. And I say in theory because often it's borrowed for other purposes. Yeah, but in theory, the money's there to do major asset replacements. And the system's working reasonably well in New Zealand in that we go back before we started asset management, a big asset, a big pipe replacement, let's say it's a foot pipe in a small town, that would be a major drama. It would be all over the front page of the local paper, and how we're going to afford this. And now there's just no issues around it. The money's there. Everybody knows the money's there. It's really just about sequencing the replacements in the right order and not going too soon or not leaving it too late. But that's New Zealand. But I think everybody has, I would suspect every state in the US has slightly different sets of rules around that.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times it's not any kind of mandate. It depends on if you're a regulated utility or not. And so very few states regulate municipal or publicly owned utilities. It's more rate regulation on privately owned utilities, but it does vary quite a bit from state to state. And oftentimes the regulated utilities, the ones who have rate regulation, have to do some type of depreciation funding, and the non-rate regulated ones are not required to. They can, but they're not required to. And I think, the question was sort of about, do you fund depreciation or do you fund replacement costs? And it's kind of two slightly different questions. And the concept of funding depreciation, I think, as Ross was talking about, is the idea that you're incrementally funding. So you're not waiting till, okay, I have a utility, I put in pipe in 1906,
yeah,
and I'm going to replace it in 2006, but I'm not going to put 1 penny aside until I hit 2006, and then all of a sudden I have to pay the replacement cost of 100 miles of pipe, which is now $100 million. So if I had done nothing for the 100 years, then where am I going to come up with the $100 million for the new pipe? But if I depreciate and fund that, what I can do is put a little bit of money aside every year.
Yeah.
And maybe it doesn't come up to $100 million. And there's even some
thinking
about,
yeah.
Whether you even should fund a whole $100 million, whether that's even possible, put that much money in the bank and have nobody rob it or use it for other purposes. So we won't go there. But just the idea that you're incrementally putting money aside. So even if it isn't the entire full replacement cost, you still have something in the bank that helps you fund that replacement later on. But when you actually come time to fund a project, you are going to be using the true replacement cost, because you're not going to fund it out of what is your depreciation. You're going to, or not, I mean, the amount of money you need is not going to come from what you've set aside for depreciation. The amount is going to come from what does it actually cost me to replace whatever assets it is that I need to replace. And then hopefully, if you've set some depreciation funding aside, which typically is in a reserve account somewhere, you've typically got a reserve account sitting somewhere for that specific purpose that hopefully others can't take the money out of for other purposes. And you pull that money out and you apply it to the replacement. It may not, and probably will not, be the whole amount you need, but it can help you, match other funds. It can help you cut down the amount you have to loan or borrow or bond. So they both are important concepts, but I think the main point of depreciation is to get you to really be thinking about renewing those assets, and that it's not out of sight, out of mind for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, whatever the time frame, and then all of a sudden, boom, I have to replace it, and I've not put any money aside to do it. So I think, the concept of funding depreciation is to help you think about an incremental funding instead of slamming your customers with this huge influx of, needed capital when you have a replacement project.
Yeah, and look, we are required to do the math in New Zealand. It's not hard math to do, but it's very, very instructive. If you sit down and you say, well, what's the life of a pipe? And we'll just use 100 years for a nice, easy figure. And you say, right, well, if my depreciation is 1% a year, and you can work out what that would be in monetary terms across a whole network. If you then, so you've got, hey, if we were funding depreciation, it's X amount of dollars a year. If you then come at it the other way, which a pure engineering way, so rightio, hey, let's depreciation's an accounting thing. Let's do it by replacement cost. Plug those in the years where they need to be. If you're getting a big discrepancy, one or other pieces of the math is wrong, and then that's a good test to say, have I got my replacement costs right, and have I got my depreciation analysis wrong? And it's a good test, and our auditors actually check authorities and networks on precisely that test. And particularly for long life assets like pipes, over a 20 or 30 year period, there might be a shortfall or from depreciation to replacement, or the other way around. You might have a lot more money accumulating depreciation, no replacements. But over the long term, those two should even up. Now, the differences of a credit or a shortfall, and particularly a shortfall, as Heather said, that's when you go, hey, if at 10 years time I've got to spend 100 million and I've only got 20 million in the bank, I've got an 80 million shortfall there. If the pipe breaks to the point where we can't supply service, doesn't matter what if you have no water, you're going to either fix the pipe or you're going to be tankering it in. You don't get too many other choices, and tankering's really expensive, so you're going to fix the pipe. But what it allows the decision makers and the governance and the funders is you go, well, okay, we've got this $80 million shortfall in 10 years' time. How are we going to meet that? Are we going to bond? Are we going to loan? Are we going to get a grant from state government or whatever it is? If we know further on we're going to have that we'll then have some new pipe and we won't have so much of an issue at 30 or 40 years. But it allows you to have that conversation early. And it also allows you to check your thinking around your replacement costs versus expected depreciation costs. If there's a big difference, then you're back to asking that why question. Why have I got that difference? Am I just doing the math wrong? Have I got the wrong assumptions into the math? Have I got not enough analysis around the depreciation, or am I overcooking my replacement costs? Those sorts of questions. So it helps you refine your assumptions and your math around those questions, and also then you're able to give more assurance to your decision makers and your funders around, hey, we've got pretty much the right numbers at the right time.
Great. And it sounded like there maybe was one more question.
Yes. So this question is a little bit more specific. They asked, is there a downside to purchasing replacement pumps and valves to meet future needs instead of investing in the current low interest rates of certificates of deposit?
Wow, that is very specific.
That is very specific.
So it sounded like, should I invest the money and get a tiny amount of return?
Yeah.
Or should I buy assets with it that would help my future customers? So Ross,
Yeah.
what do you think about that?
Well, I think Heather and I had a conversation yesterday about a bit of this subject. And one of the things in asset management, particularly around pumps and valves, is the people who are tasked with maintaining them are tasked with, if the pump goes down or the valve is broken or stuck, they will jump in there and try and repair it because that's the job they've been given. And if that valve or pump is very near the end of its life, so let's say it's a pump that's 25 or 30 years old and you're actually planning to replace it in 2 or 3 years, you can often spend nearly half or 2/3 of the price of a new asset fixing or doing an emergency repair on the old one. And that just doesn't make any sense. So one of the things that you can do there is try and get some metrics or some information in place for the repair crews that says, hey, we're within 5 years of replacing this particular pump. If it breaks, we almost always have a standby pump. Run the standby, buy a new one. Much better result. So that means you're not, so what you're trying to do is not waste money repairing really old assets when buying a new asset at that time would be a better idea. Now, in terms of investing money versus purchasing or forward purchasing valves and pumps, first of all, obviously every authority has a treasury policy, and so there's been approved by somebody, so you've got to look at what your treasury policy says. You're trying not to replace stuff early with asset management. I mean, the idea is that you're trying to get your optimal life cycle spend. So unless the asset was a particularly high risk asset where replacing it early made sense in terms of managing risk, I think you would be going, hey, if we can get another 10 years of life out of this asset without it causing us any operational problems, that's a really good thing. Because if we buy now early, buy a new asset, we're just throwing away that 10 years of life that we still had in the old asset. So that type of analysis then assumes you know enough about that asset. So, and maybe you don't. So the first thing you do is then go, okay, well, let's go and get some measurements and some instrumentation or some analysis on how long that pump or valve is likely to last. How important is it to us in our network? If it's in the last 5 years of its life and it's highly important, then maybe, yeah, let's go replace it now before it gives us problem. If it's a slightly less important asset and we can live with a little bit of failure, operational failure, without it causing us issues, well, I'd be trying to get as long out of it as I could and just tuck the money away. But that's more around just trying to get optimizing as much life out of assets as you can without it impacting on the service you're providing.
And the other thing to think about is if what you're talking about is buying parts that you're not going to use. So for example, we want to buy a bunch of valves and we're going to sit them on a shelf for when we need it, or we're going to buy meters or something like that. Be really, really careful about doing something like that, because you really want to only have as many spare parts on the shelf as you actually need for the short term, because oftentimes people don't take good care of inventory that's sitting on a shelf somewhere. It's not put in the proper environment. So it might be sitting outside in the weather, or it might be subjected to the sun.
Then you find all the seals are gone.
Yeah, and like rubber gaskets might wear out. So people who have had stuff on the shelf for a long period of time will find it doesn't work, or you've switched technologies. So that happens a lot too with meters. So people bought a whole bunch of meters and then you decide you're going to go to automated meter reading or something, and you decide, oh, I can't use these meters anymore. So now all of a sudden I have a bunch of meters that I got to throw away.
Or even worse, those meters that you bought heaps of, you've put a few in, and then you find they're not as reliable or as accurate as you thought they might be, and you go, oh, I really wish I didn't have any more of those meters, and you've got another 300 or 400 sitting on the shelf in the depot. It's not a good place to be.
Yeah, so just be cautious. I mean, I don't recommend that you have a whole bunch of extra stuff sitting on a shelf. If you're not needing it in a short period of time, like let's say whatever I need in 6 months, or and again, it depends on how long it takes you to get supplies. Like if you can get supplies fairly well in a 3-month period, then maybe you keep enough on the shelf for 4 months, so you have a little bit of time to order new. But you don't want to have 4 years worth of parts, because you want to be renewing that inventory. You don't want it sitting around. And, you know, I don't know how many times I've been places where brand new thing is completely, or what was a brand new thing sat on a shelf so long that it's not usable anymore. And that's just a complete waste of money. So we want to be careful about not spending our money to buy parts that aren't going to be used right away. So I would say, unless there's a need to buy something, you know, even if you're not making a huge amount on your investment, you're still better off to keep it there until it makes sense to purchase those parts or to replace something.
Yeah, the exception to that, both Heather and I do work in the Pacific Islands, and they're quite isolated often, and you know, it might be several months before you can, even if you ordered today, it might be 3 or 4 or 5 months before the ship comes with the component that you've ordered. And in that case, you run a different policy around parts and components. Simply because of isolation. So yeah, the commentary we were making was for more mainland type utilities, where you know, the ability to get stuff is days away or a week at the outside, and so you're better off to leave that in somebody else's storeroom, the suppliers, and then grab it when you need it.
Great. So I wanted to just mention, somebody had written in a question about benefits of asset management, and because of time we won't have a chance to get to every question that was asked, but I wanted to make reference to the fact that just a couple of weeks ago we did a webinar on benefits of asset management, and on the screen you'll see a link to that. That will be included in the slides when we post it. You can link to that, or you can find it on the EFC network website. So there are tons of benefits to doing asset management, and that webinar talks about the categories of benefits and describes a couple of benefits from projects. So I wanted to just refer folks to that to talk about the benefits of asset management.
Just before we jump to this one, should we just, are there any more questions, I think?
Oh yeah, were there additional questions?
Not at this point, that was it.
Okay.
Okay.
So we had several questions that related to the cost of asset management, and, you know, how expensive was it going to be, how much was it going to cost, and we wanted to spend a few minutes just talking about costs of asset management, because I think both of our opinions is it doesn't have to cost a lot of money. So let's talk a little bit about that, and how this doesn't have to be a big, grandiose, expensive thing that somebody does, especially for the smaller utilities.
Yeah, and the starting point, I think, and this is where I really like the EFC model that you run here in the US, and the support that you have available, is that there's an awful lot of free support available. And I've been consulting in New Zealand and internationally now for 21 years. So I make my living from helping people consulting with asset management. But the people we like working with the most in our practice is people where they want a bit of mentoring or a little bit of particular support in an area, but they don't want us to do the whole lot. And there's always going to be somebody that comes and says, look, you know, just chuck a gob of money at me and we'll make all your problems go away. That may be their opinion. I think the really big gains are when the staff of the authority engage, or the system, and they learn along the way, and they learn around the thinking. And the good news is that there is a massive amount of resource available to get you well down the track of that. And as we've already said earlier in the webinar, starting simple, getting, you know, doing the basics well, that's the 80-20. You know, you can spend 20% of your effort, get 80% of the result. If you need to chase the last 20%, that's going to take a lot of extra effort and cost. But for most organisations, I think, you know, the getting to 80% is a really good place to get to. And so this is probably a good point for you to talk about your resource page, your switchboard.
Yeah, and I wanted to make reference to something that's brand new, hot off the presses. We have started an asset management switchboard. We did this in conjunction with EPA headquarters, where we were trying to collect all the free resources available from around the country into one place, so that, you know, it could be it can be one-stop shopping. These are not actually on our website, but rather links to the things in the different states around the country or assistance providers. We're always looking for more, so if anybody sees a resource that they think should be up there and is not, please let us know. We will gladly add it. But the switchboard will help you figure out resources on getting started or doing the 5 core components, or once I have a plan, how do I go beyond that? So we have like a beyond the basics. And there's lots and lots and lots of resources up there. And like I said, we're going to keep adding to those resources as we go along. So we want to make sure we collect all of these different things so that you can go to one place and find resources. And again, to help you as much as possible do it yourself. And then Ross has a web page, and I collaborate some on this, informanage.com, and there's a lot of good resources up there as well, yeah, that utilities can access. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so I just have a vision, if you like, of being able to provide resources internationally. I do work in marginalised communities as well. Similar to Heather's work with the tribal areas where they don't have a lot of resources sometimes. So the informanage.com is just a collation of a large range of resources. We keep adding to them. These webinars go up on it, but I do things like Auckland University every year in New Zealand. I do a lecture for the master's program in asset management, often on demand management or risk. And so those lectures go up and things like that. And then when I find really good stuff around the internet, I link to that as well. And I do little vlogs as well of just on a single subject. So that's all up there. And the idea is that anybody can jump in and have a look at it. And the driver behind that is people in faraway places with not very good resources, never going to get to a conference on asset management, or even in the developing countries, they're not even going to be able to buy the manuals or the literature. They're not resourced for it, but you know, they know about it. They've heard about it somewhere. They want to, hey, what's this asset management? I can do my job better for my community. So that's the thinking. My master's degree the thesis was on asset management for developing countries and why it doesn't stick there. So it's a bit of a passion of mine. But that resource, I keep adding to it. I have a big backlog of stuff to add at the moment, but that'll happen over the next few months. And feel free to go and have a look. And there's a sign-up area for a free newsletter and things like that. So just encourage you, if you are looking for resources, there is plenty of stuff there.
And one of the things that we want to make a point about is that asset management is about thinking. And anybody who's come to one of my trainings will hear me say that it's not about technology, it's about the thinking around your assets. You can use technology in various ways to help you, but it's really the thinking that gets you where you need to go. And you can't shortcut that. You have to think about these assets. You have to think, you know, what do I need to do? What's going on in my system? You have to do that thinking part. And you can't outsource that. You can't write a big old document and hope that that's going to solve your problem. You can't even buy a piece of software and push a button and give it, you know, have it give you all the answers, because there isn't a shortcut way of doing the thinking that goes around it, because you still have to make decisions. You still have to be the one, you know, in charge of the overall picture. So just remember that again, that thinking doesn't have to cost you a lot of money. It's just changing your mindset to ask yourself some questions. Why is this happening? You know, where are we having problems? What is the main thing going on in our system that, you know, keeps us up at night? And just that simple kind of thinking can really get you some good benefits and some quick wins. So don't be thinking that if I don't spend a bunch of money on a 200-page document, that I'm not going to get where I need to go, because that's simply not true. It really doesn't have to be a super complex thing. And my first couple trips over to New Zealand and Australia told me that, because many of the systems had done exactly that. They started out with a 5-volume, couple hundred pages per volume asset management plan, and decided that that didn't help them at all. And they needed to start from scratch and say, okay, let's regroup. What do we really need to do? And then they would pull out, you know, a 30-page plan and say, this is working really well. And you could see it was coffee stained and dog-eared and written on, and you could tell somebody was using it, that they were actually working from that versus the thing sitting on the shelf that looked beautiful but didn't really help them.
And I think, you know, particularly with water and wastewater networks, often the issues you're dealing with have accumulated over decades. And so the thought that you can in 1 year solve all those problems is unrealistic, both in terms of your human resources, even if you get the biggest and bestest consulting firm in the world, and certainly in terms of your organizational ability to manage that. So the trick is, and this comes back to the quick wins and quick gains, it's a bit like the old, if you've ever looked at the lean company startup stuff, where you cycle fast. Yeah, here's a problem, solve that fast, right, get that one knocked off, here's the next one. Because you don't get the resource or the funding if you're going to try and do something. Oh, look, we're going to solve this problem that's going to take us 20 years. It's never going to be resourced or funded. But you can break a big problem down into a whole lot of little problems, and you know, it's just basic project management, and go, right, what's number one? Oh yeah, we need to do that. And as Heather was saying with the thinking, it's like when you step back from this is the way we always did it, or we must do it this way, and just take a fresh look at the issue, maybe a wider look at the issue, rethink it, maybe put a lot of people in a room to brainstorm the issue and why is it that, and all of a sudden you find that 5 different parts of the organisation all have 5 different answers and they haven't talked to each other about it. Just that process alone you can get some phenomenal gains. And I haven't met a CEO yet when all of the different teams are working together well and have come up with an innovative answer that they don't like that. Normally they're absolutely thrilled that that is happening, and haven't quite worked out how to achieve that themselves. So, and you can hire a bit like and again, I do like the EFC model here in the US, because Heather and her team do a lot of mentoring and a lot of training. That's a really good way to stimulate the thinking. Sometimes you can't do that. You hire a specialist. Try and hire one that passes on information. Black boxes inside large firms are not much help to you at the end of the day. Sometimes you just need that. You go, look, I want an answer, I want it yesterday, and you hire somebody to do that for you. That's okay. But the understanding of the organisation of the issues and the adaptation and change of that organisation over a period of 3 or 5 years or longer, into a asset management thinking and mindset will just deliver unbelievable gains, both organisationally and fiscally. And you'll find there's a whole lot of things that you were doing that you probably won't do. And I'll give you a little example of that. In New Zealand, there's quite a large city that we had, and they had, I think it was 120 wastewater pump stations, 2 pump stations, and about 6 or 7 quite a lot larger ones with really big pumps. And they had a maintenance inspection regime where the maintenance teams went every single day to those pump stations to make sure they were okay. But they had full remote SCADA systems on them with sensors from here to Africa. And so I said to them, why are you sending guys there every single day? And the answer was, that's what we've always done. Why have we always done that? Well, back in the days before all the sensors and all the SCADA systems, you couldn't not go and visit them because you might have some blockages or some problems and you didn't want to have an overflow and you didn't want to, Well, that was really, really good practice 40 years ago or 30 years ago, but not now. So they were about, the question came up when we were out, there was an outsourcing contract renewal, and they were about to write into this contract, you shall go to the pump station with a crew, and that meant 2 or 3 team members of the crew and the vehicle and all that, every day for 120 pump stations. So then you do the math on that, you're saying, actually, we need 3 or 4 crews. And just that one little discussion, said, actually, we don't need to do that. Maybe once a week would be fine. And I actually suggested to them once every 2 weeks, but no, they weren't quite comfortable with that. So they came back to once a week. But the money they saved was, now the guys who were doing that didn't get laid off. They just got redeployed to do other stuff that was important, more pump maintenance and stuff like that, rather than just running around looking at the wells and the any blockages and looking at the instrumentation in the pump station, which was already mirrored back to the main office. So yeah, so it's things like that. You can just have really simple conversations like that that can end up changing your practices, doesn't create any more risk, and can save a huge amount of expenditure. It's not to say what they were doing previously was wrong, because it was appropriate before they had all the monitoring, but it just hadn't changed with the monitoring. And there's lots of stories like that, I think.
Okay, well, we're going to move on. Oops, that was gonna, we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to just say a few words about software. There's a reason that software is at the end of this webinar. We did get a fair number of questions about asset management, or CMMS, which is Computerized Maintenance Management System software. We did get a fair number of questions. We didn't want to put them up front because, again, we want people to be aware as much as possible. It's about thinking, it's not about the technology. Doesn't mean there isn't a place for technology and that technology isn't helpful, because it's very helpful, or can be very helpful. But it's really important to understand that software is not asset management. It's a tool to help you do your asset management thinking, but it's not one and the same. So we wanted to make sure that nobody got the wrong impression that it's about the software. So we wanted to share just a few words about the fact that you really need to have some idea of what it is you want the software to do before you even go down that path. Like, why do I want a software? If I've actually had places tell me, well, I want to just put in a bunch of data, push a button, and it does everything for me. Well, that is not what software is about.
I would love that too, though.
Yeah, I think we would all love that. It would make our jobs a whole lot easier. But the computers, even with artificial intelligence, they're not going to replace you.
Yeah.
You still need to be doing the thinking around things. The computer's not out in the field. The computer doesn't have all the knowledge you do. It has some of it. But you need to think about why you want a piece of software, what you're going to use it for, and really think that through before you go down this path. I mean, you shouldn't have the idea that right away, right at the beginning, if I'm going to do asset management, I have to buy something. You want to work your way into that by looking at, you know, what do you want to get out of the software? What are those outputs you want out? What inputs would you have to get that out? Could you even do that? You know, do you have the people, the data, you know, the resources to do that? What's the money you have available to do this? Because almost every piece of software is going to cost you something. There aren't that many free softwares that really do a whole range of asset management things but don't cost you any money. There are some that will do like an inventory for you pretty well. There are some low-cost apps that really help well with inventories and things like that. So you can look there, but if you want a more robust program that does capital planning and maintenance and work order systems and that, you're probably looking at paying some money. And you're not just going to pay up front, you're going to pay annually. Because most softwares now, there's an annual fee. So you really have to think about, do I have the resources available to pay for a piece of software over time? Because if you don't, then going down this path is probably not going to be very helpful in the long term, because you're not going to want to keep investing. So you
There's
really have to
also
think
quite
about
a
that.
big organizational cost around the
Yes.
people to manage the software and to make sure you're getting the data and the information in, it's in the right quality, going back to our service guy with the alligator. So all of that sort of stuff you have to deal with. Otherwise, there's a very, very old saying with software, garbage in, garbage out. And you really have to get your head around all of those sorts of issues. And they do impose a cost on an organization over a period of time.
And then the last thing I want to say about it, because I know we're just about out of time, is that I'm asked all the time, what should I buy? And that is not a question that is possible to answer without going through a thorough investigation of what it is you want to do, what it is you want to get out of it, your technical capabilities, your IT, all of that sort of stuff, because not every piece of software is the same. It's not just a matter of I'm buying the same thing, but who am I buying it from? Everybody's software is slightly different from everybody else's. So you have to actually go through a thorough process. And if you do, I believe you will come up with the software that you like, that fits what you want to do. But you can't short circuit that process. You really do need to move on and go forward to do an RFP. So we're now at noon. I just put up on the screen the InfoManage again and EFCnetwork.org. EFC Network has these webinars and lots of other resources up there. And then don't forget about the switchboard. And for the other questions that we didn't get to, we have two options that we're looking at. One is sending out some written responses, and the other is we're hoping to do another one of these webinars in August.
Yeah.
And with good fortune, Ross will be back here in the States in August, and we can do another one. And we'll get to some of the questions that are more of group interest in that one. So the ones that are more individual questions relate to maybe one utility. We'll try to answer those directly, and then maybe we'll keep some of the other ones for the next webinar. So Savannah, if you want to take it away and close us out.
Thank you, Heather and Ross. Thank you both for being here today to provide your expertise. And yes, to wrap up, there are just two quick last items. The first being a poll question. The Environmental Finance Center Network does provide technical assistance for small water systems throughout the U.S. and their territories. So if you would like to learn more and get connected with experts on some of these topics, please let us know here. And we'll leave this poll open for about another 5 seconds.
And just for clarification, small is anything 10,000 population or fewer.
Yes. And so we'll leave this poll open and getting ready to close in 3, 2, 1. And lastly, in that chat box, there will be a evaluation link coming to you all. If you do have a few moments to let us know your thoughts and provide any feedback for today's session, that would be wonderful. Thank you in advance for your time and helping formulate our webinars for the future. All right, Heather and Ross, thank you both so much. If there's anything else, say it now.
I just wanted to thank Ross again. I really appreciate being here and being willing to share time with us on this webinar. I love having a colleague that I can talk about asset management with and share it all with you guys. And I think, just the amount of information we can bring from other places and other ways of thinking can really be helpful. So I really appreciate everybody being on today. And again, thank Ross very much for being here with us today and sharing.
It's always a pleasure.
Thank you so much to both of you. Have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone.
Thank you.